read, and so this comes out. This is part of that, and it's on the early Heidegger. Okay, so it's a common observation that Heidegger's writings do not contain an ethics of the sort that modern readers of philosophy have come to expect. He does not speak of virtue or obligations to others, or present a formula for deriving categorically binding principles, or analyze moral sentiments such as sympathy and indignation. And yet, one would be hard-pressed to find a single text in Heidegger's voluminous corpus that does not impinge on questions of how to be, articulated in an unmistakably evaluative manner. Indeed, the appeal of Heidegger's thought for many readers has been precisely this constant attention to the relation between philosophy and concrete being in the world, where we are always confronted with the need to make decisions about appropriate conduct. Now I'm going to focus here on Heidegger's relation to ethics in two works of this early period, Being in Time, his well-known masterpiece of phenomenology, and The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, which is a lecture course that he gave in 1929 and 30. Now my topic is not politics, so I won't address Heidegger's, in my view, short-lived commitment to Nazism in the early 1930s, though we can talk about it in the discussion period if you want. Okay, so let's start with Being in Time's account of moral personhood and the ideal of authenticity. Being in Time begins with a seemingly abstract semantic question about the meaning of the verb to be, but quickly becomes an inquiry into the nature of the I myself. This I is described not as a knowing subject of consciousness, but an agent who stands before possibilities, who matters to itself, and who makes decisions about how to be. Moreover, Heidegger's claim that inauthenticity does not signify a lower degree of being fits poorly with his suggestion that this is an unowned way to be, in which Dasein has lost itself through fleeing and forgetting. So we have at this preliminary stage a sketch of the self as free and responsible, and yet as inclined to exist in a manner that avoids being so. Although Heidegger does not use the language ought and should, both these elements in his analysis of Dasein, the character of the self and the call to authenticity, are centrally concerned with ethics. You'd be hard-pressed to say, okay, well, there's nothing wrong with being inauthentic. I like fleeing and forgetting and being deluded. Words have meaning, so no. Okay, let me examine these two features in turn. So having selected an entity, I myself, Heidegger's investigation also has to determine which mode of this entity's existence to examine. Unlike Descartes, whose meditations reflect on the I as it is when engaged in detached knowing, Heidegger opts to look at how we are in our average, everyday way of being in the world, where we are absorbed in our practical concerns. He takes a clue from the nature of the things we encounter when preoccupied in this fashion. They do not show up for us as material substances exhibiting such and such properties. Rather, we apprehend them in relation to the purposes for which they are designed and used. They are grasped in terms of an in order to, he writes, assigned in terms to for the sake of, such that the meaningful world of our ordinary practical activity and interaction with others turns out to be not a collection of substances, but the structured totality of the ends we project in our shared existence. For instance, in the case of a hammer, quote, there is an involvement in hammering with making something fast, there is an involvement in protection against bad weather, and this protection is for the sake of providing shelter for Dasein. That is to say, for the sake of a possibility of Dasein's being. This type of involvement, the fact that the hammer is what it is, quad hammer, in relation to what it is for, makes things like hammers essentially ready to handle. They are means for accomplishing goals ultimately rooted in care for our own existence, and they are judged in relation to their suitability for this or that purpose. Our existence is then the final referent, bestowing significance on what we encounter as available for use within the world, and it has a different character from these items of use. Quote, the totality of involvements itself goes back ultimately to a towards which, in which there is no further involvement. This towards which is not an entity with the kind of being that belongs to what is ready to hand within. It's not a tool, an object. Okay. This entity is not a means to a further end. It is the entity who projects ends in light of which things within the world appear to it as means. Having made these points, Heidegger remarks, We have thus indicated the interaction by which the structure of an involvement leads to Dasein's very being as the sole authentic for the sake of virtue. So Dasein turns out to be the end of all the means, the ultimate end, the sole authentic for the sake of virtue. So like a number of other scholars, I see in this analysis a phenomenological retrieval of Kant's distinction between persons and things. That distinction grounds one version of Kant's categorical imperative, a formula of humanity that forbids treating rational natures purely as means, ignoring their status as ends in themselves. Interpreted together with Heidegger's later analysis of liberating solicitude as a positive mode of being with one another, the Kantian normative implications of the passage I'm discussing are unmistakable. Solicitude, Fürsorge, in German, literally care for, is, in Heidegger's analysis, the appropriate mode of comportment towards others whose being is not like that of ready-to-hand equipment, but who are themselves Dasein. It has two positive modes. One leaps in and takes over for the other's existence, potentially rendering him or her dependent and dominated. A contrasting possibility helps the other to become transparent to himself, this is a quote, in his care, and to become free for it. This mode of solicitude, which Heidegger writes pertains essentially to authentic care, springs ahead and liberates the other rather than taking charge of his or her concerns. I think this account echoes Kant's claim in the Critique of Practical Reason that respect is always directed towards persons, never towards things, a statement Heidegger cites in Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics, published 2 years after being attacked. On Heidegger's interpretation, such respect, quote, manifests the I in its dignity. It is a feeling of self-elevation before the free creature which determines itself, who, quote, does not come to be determined through self-conceit and self-love, unquote. Heidegger describes his self in the language of authenticity that he uses in Being and Time. So when he's interpreting Kant on personhood and respect, he uses that language that he had used in Being and Time. Now, unlike Kant, he does not say that entities like myself, those we designate as who rather than what, he doesn't make that distinction. He doesn't say that they should not or must not be treated purely as means, but also always as ends in themselves. But his ontological description suggests that the very character of an entity, for instance, a person, entails a right way of being towards it, one that recognizes what it is in truth. On this point, I agree with Frank Shallow and Julian Young. Heidegger rejects the fact-value distinction in approaching questions about the good, seeing in this distinction a specifically modern philosophical frame and not the only possible one. Now, it's unknown to Aristotle, for instance, who does have an ethics. For Heidegger, holding oneself to the truth of the I as capable of self-determination beyond the push and pull of everyday practical concerns means being with others in the authentic manner that he describes as liberating solicitude. That's all there is to it for Heidegger. The rest, he thinks, he describes as evasion. Now, there is also, we should note, no counterpart in Being and Time to the criterion of universality that forms an essential version of the categorical imperative within Kant's moral philosophy. Instead, Being and Time outlines a situationist ethic led by the ideal of authenticity. Heidegger's interpretation of respect for the moral law in Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics includes a reference to this ideal. Quote, in respect before the law, says Heidegger, which as a free creature I give to myself, I cannot despise myself. Hence, respect is the manner of the being itself of the I, on the grounds of which it, quote, and there are quotes in Heidegger's text, does not throw away the hero in its soul, unquote. Respect is the manner of the self being responsible, face to face with itself. It is authentic being itself. So authentic being itself is being responsible and recognition, an appropriate way of being towards entities of the character of the Dasein is liberating solicitude, simply in virtue of the kinds of entities that they are. Now, in Being and Time, having a relation to my own being such that I can decide to be in one manner or another makes me responsible for myself, in spite of having been thrown into the world through an act that was not my own, no excuses, into conditions I did not determine. I am authentically myself when I take hold of my being and accept this responsibility, enacting the finite freedom I have in my own very particular situation before death ends my possibilities once and for all. I'm not necessarily agreeing with Heidegger on this, just pointing out it is a very Kantian. It has also the flaws of Kantian. Heidegger describes this assumption of responsibility as a recovery of myself against the pull of everyday busyness and the they, das Man, a sort of false subject constructed through self-distraction and passively following customary expectations. The allusion to an inner hero in the lines I just cited on Kantian respect is actually taken from a passage in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra that castigates, that passage in Nietzsche's text castigates noble men who lost their highest hope, writes Nietzsche, and ended up living impudently in brief pleasures with hardly an aim for the day. Once they thought of becoming heroes, Nietzsche says, through the persona of Zarathustra, but now they are sensualists, and he entreats them, do not reject the hero in your soul. Being Time also mentions the possibility of choosing a hero in his description of an authentic relation to the past, where we are searching for repeatable possibilities of existence and models, right, that we can admire and emulate. Nietzsche's essay, The Use and Abuse of History for Life, which Heidegger discusses in some detail, outlines precisely such a relation to the past, led by an interest in its value for life. Heidegger also cites Nietzsche in claiming that through an authentic anticipation of death, Dasein guards itself against becoming too old for its victories. Although Nietzsche himself rarely mentions death, and at times even advocates forgetting it. Like for Nietzsche, illusions that serve life are more valuable than truth that destroys life, and too much remembrance of death is enervating. As an atheist, no afterlife, so not much consolation in the face of death. Nietzsche and Kant are in many ways polar opposites on morality, but they both pay homage to the capacity for self-mastery. This is a common thread that Heidegger appropriates, runs all through German philosophy of this, a couple of centuries. This is the common thread that Heidegger appropriates and adapts in his phenomenological account of authenticity. For varieties of ethics rooted in decision, as the account in Being Time certainly is, the capacity for such self-mastery is a necessary condition for being ethical. It cannot be a sufficient condition. Obviously, people may exert self-discipline in the service of morally heinous acts. Heidegger's selection of the term resoluteness and Schlossenheit for authentic being in the world has led some commentators to see in this ideal an empty decisionism in which the choice of a hero is not constrained by any moral considerations. But the analysis offered in Being in Time should mean that decisions made with proper attention to truth are led by recognition of the character of Dasein, with its implications for how persons may and may not be treated, may and may not be appropriately treated. According to that analysis, liberating solicitude is the appropriate mode of comportment toward any such entity, the fitting mode. It fits how it is. Angemessen is the German term that it uses. Any such entity, not only towards those with whom I share a world in a historical community. Resoluteness, moreover, is not described as egoistic self-assertion in Being in Time. It's not will to power. It is rather willingness to heed the call of conscience, and in so doing to accept being guilty. That's in the text. When Heidegger's recounting of what existence is like, the average everyday way of being, in which I am not truly myself, is haunted by anxiety, angst, and an uneasy sense of not being at home in the world. This anxiety, if I am willing to face it, tells me that I'm running away from my finite freedom, my responsibility for accomplishing what I may be and do in the time that remains to me. The voice of conscience recalls me to that responsibility, and thus to this possibility of an authentic or owned way of being, one in which I have hold over my own existence, right, rather than just following paths that are laid out. While we ordinarily think of conscience as reproving and warning, Heidegger describes a call of conscience as an appeal that calls Dasein to being itself by way of summoning it to its own most being guilty. Conscience calls me away from my usual absorptions in the world towards grasping myself as a free basis for an existence that is always imperfect, where I do not determine myself from the ground up, and where my choices are always exclusive. Heidegger sees this primordial guilt, quote unquote, as the basis for the more usual significations of the term as owing and being responsible, including having the responsibility for the others becoming endangered in his existence, led astray, or even ruined. So it includes responsibility for others. In other words, it is because I can project and choose between possibilities. Now that lies in the ontological structure of Dasein. That I become the ground for a lack or a not in being, the cause of my failure to do what I could have done, for instance, or to be what I might have been. The most basic decision I make on Heidegger's account is between the willingness to accept this being guilty or not, the willingness to hear and submit to the call of conscience or not. Nothing compels me one way or another. It's in that sense that the decision is ex nihilo. It is made in response to the definite set of circumstances in which a particular person finds herself, and that gives conscience its content. When the call of conscience, so the quote, gives us a potentiality for being to understand, Heidegger writes, it does not give us one which is ideal and universal. It discloses it as that which has been currently individualized and which belongs to that particular Dasein. In a lecture course delivered a few years before the publication of Being in Time, Heidegger rather peculiarly describes Aristotle's notion of phronesis as nothing more than conscience set into motion. It's a pretty violent reading of Aristotle's, Christianized reading of Aristotle. For Aristotle, Heidegger writes, since practical action moves in each case within a definite surrounding world, this action is carried out under determined circumstances, which then characterize a situation in which Dasein at any time finds itself. So this analysis then anticipates the situationist ethic he develops in Being in Time, where resolute willingness to follow conscience turns what could be encountered as mere circumstances, mere meaningless circumstances and accidents, into a situation, the locus for decisive action. Aristotle's own notion of phronesis involves a kind of practical wisdom that pertains to action requiring good judgment and virtuous character. Exploring the relation between Heidegger and Aristotle on this point, Bernasconi writes, for Aristotle, it is not a rule, but the situation itself, which seems to make the demand on someone to act in a specific way. And that means that everything depends on one's ability to see the situation. Such seeing is not theoretical, precisely because to see what a situation calls for is already to act. Now, Heidegger, though, assimilates Aristotle to other sources, especially Christian ones, that shape the analysis he eventually gives of action and decision in Being in Time. There are some contemporary analytic scholars of Heidegger who seem to resolutely ignore that. But, it's clear. And he started out as a Catholic theologian. When resolute, he writes in Being in Time, Dasein has brought itself back from falling, and has done so precisely in order to be more authentically there in the moment of vision as regards the situation which has been disclosed. Repetition, Wiederholung, it literally means fetching back, names the constantly reiterated resolve to face anxiety and be ready for what is required of me against the temptations of the everyday world with an honest acceptance of guilt and death. Heidegger's elaboration of these points owes at least as much to St. Paul, Luther, and Kierkegaard as to Aristotle. That doesn't mean he's covertly smuggling theological commitments into a phenomenological account. It's not that. Phenomenological account that is supposed to bracket culturally specific presuppositions and theories. It is instead that in his appropriation of Christian themes, he exposes what he sees as the existential roots of Christian faith as a way of being, the structures of existence that make possible a life in which original sin and conversion are realities. Okay, with then the actual Christian stories being big stories that are ontic accounts built on that ontological foundation. Okay. In meantime, then resoluteness names the basic decision to heed and bind oneself to the call of conscience. Heidegger's description of it as a sudden turning is reminiscent of St. Paul's account of the moment of conversion, in which one becomes, as it were, reborn. So he's interested in this phenomenon, right? It's not necessarily religious conversion. What he's interested in is how someone suddenly might turn their life around, right? Accept their guilt, accept responsibility, and become reborn as a new person, an ethical person. Because that's what St. Paul's account is. He had been persecuting Christians, and suddenly on the road to Damascus, he has a revelation. Christ comes to him, but it's Heidegger gives us an existential interpretation. How is this possible? It does happen. How can it happen? His account is also heavily indebted to Kierkegaard's reflections on the moment. He takes that term from Kierkegaard. Infused with anxiety and guilt, where an individual repents and begins a new life. I would venture that Heidegger thinks Kant is speaking of the same phenomenon when Kant writes in Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View, quote, the establishment of character is similar to a kind of rebirth, a certain solemn resolution which the person himself makes. This resolution and the moment at which the transformation took place remain unforgettable, like the beginning of a new epoch. This stability and persistence in principles can generally not be affected by education, examples, and instruction by degrees, but it can only be done by an explosion, which suddenly occurs as a consequence of our disgust at the unsteady condition of instinct. Heidegger doesn't see the result as persistence in principles. Within the situationist ethics of being in time, there are no rules that can guide every individual in every situation, time, and culture. Instead, the self's resoluteness against the inconstancy of distraction is a constancy that brings Dasein into a moment of vision for what is world historical in its current situation. As I've argued, though, there are constraints imposed by appropriate recognition of the kind of entity that Dasein is. Critics have reasonably complained of Heidegger's negative portrayal of everyday sociality as falling into idle chatter, distraction, and covert enmity. Though there is a lot of that in our everyday interactions. But that all describes inauthentic being with, to which liberating solicitude is supposed to be the authentic correct. The passages on falling echo Pascal's observation that the human condition is one of inconstancy, boredom, anxiety, from which we run into entertaining distractions to avoid facing death and acuity. So being in time describes the alternative as a resolve to hold myself in the truth, binding myself to the call of conscience in every testing moment. Thus, the description of authenticity in being in time points to a how of existence, which shares with virtue ethics the aim of cultivating a disposition, a way that I might be, but blends this with views of guilt, conscience, and decision that are drawn from Christian sources. Resoluteness is an ideal way to be, and it is valorized, whatever Heidegger may say about phenomenological neutrality. Resoluteness suggests both self-assertion and responsiveness. It is decision, an act on my part, but it is also a kind of willingness made in response to the call of conscience that comes from me and yet from beyond me. And to the specific needs of the situation in which I am placed as the individual I am. A few years later, in the origin of the work of art, Heidegger describes a kind of willing that is not, quote, the performance or act of a subject striving toward himself as his self-set goal, and writes that, quote, the resoluteness thought in being in time is not the decisive action of the subject, but rather the human being's opening up from out of its captivity by beings into the openness of being. So he describes it as more as responsiveness, more and more as his thought develops. But this notion now of captivity plays a central role in Heidegger's analysis of animality in the fundamental concepts of metaphysics, to which I now want to turn. Wittgenstein thematizes the being of persons, tools, and objects, but it says almost nothing about animals. On the rare occasion when they are mentioned, it is only to say, without further analysis, that we are acquainted with them as raw material and products, or that they are living beings who differ from us in lacking a relation to death and not having the kind of temporality that we do. In the fundamental concepts of metaphysics, however, this lecture course he gave in 1929-30, Heidegger offers an extended analysis of animality, explicating three pieces. One, the stone, the material object, is worldless. Two, the animal is poor in world, Weltanschauung, it's a German. Man is world-forming. He proceeds to give an account of the being of animals in privative terms. That is, he defines animals as lacking certain basic characteristics of humanity, those that make it possible for entities like us to build and have a distinctively human world. This account has been widely criticized for faulty methodology and for an anthropocentrism that repeats doubtful beliefs about the distinction between ourselves and animals to establish an absolute difference of kind. The animal is separated from man by an abyss, Heidegger claims, reiterating a traditional view that historically has served to elevate ourselves while excluding animals and human beings who are allegedly more like animals from moral concern. Those are legitimate criticisms of Heidegger's account. A central flaw in this approach to working out the essence of the animal is Heidegger's absurdly narrow selection of examples. His observations are largely derived from studies of unicellular organisms and insects, and yet his conclusion claims to cover all animals, every animal. His fundamental nature is defined in contradistinction from the essence of humanity, the essence of the humanity of man. But in a sense, the account is not about animals at all. It's about what Heidegger sees as the essential character of the human, made explicit through philosophical reflection on an idea of animality that he claims is the presupposition of the science of zoology, which it was and continued to be for quite a long time until those presuppositions about the character of animals were challenged. His analysis exemplifies the unavoidably circular character of philosophical thought, he tells us, which moves by clarifying fundamental concepts that are basic to positive sciences, and therefore cannot be derived from their results, but does so in a manner that is also not indifferent to those results. Now, I would argue in criticism that Heidegger's account is actually a good example of how not to move within the hermeneutic circle, since open-minded attention to a wider range of the entities gathered under the concept of animal might have alerted Heidegger to inadequacies and motivated revision. Still, the analysis remains valuable if approached not for accurate insights about animals, okay, but as revealing Heidegger's understanding of the nature and ethical implications of human freedom. And it's still kind of Kantian in that regard, and that Kant also, repeated that traditional gesture of defining humanity in contradistinction to animality, even dividing human nature into two, right? The natural part and the rational part. Okay. According to Heidegger, what distinguishes human beings and makes them world-building is their capacity to perceive something as something. You might think, not immediately connect that with ethics, but for Heidegger, it is connected. Okay. Material objects have no access to their environment at all, and so no world. Animals do, but their world poverty consists, Heidegger claims, in the lack of this specific ability to relate to a being as a being. And I'll read a few sentences since this quote is worth dwelling on. When we say that the lizard is lying on the rock, writes Heidegger, we ought to cross out the word rock in order to indicate that whatever the lizard is lying on is certainly given in some way for the lizard, and yet is not known to the lizard as a rock. If we cross out the word, we do not simply mean to imply that something else is in question here or is taken as something else. Rather, we imply that whatever it is not accessible to it, the lizard, as a being. The blade of grass that the beetle crawls up, for example, is not a blade of grass for it at all. It is not something possibly destined to become part of the bundle of hay with which the peasant will feed the cow. The blade of grass is simply a beetle path on which the beetle specifically seeks beetle nourishment, and not just any edible matter in general. Every animal has a specific set of relationships to its sources of nourishment, its prey, its enemies, its sexual mates, and so on. Okay. Heidegger names Hans Driesch and Jacob Johann von Uexküll as contemporary sources for the experiments and conclusions he presents as evidence for this picture of animals. Driesch was known for experiments with sea urchins, which led him to reject mechanistic theories and adopt a version of Aristotle's notion of intelligence, a teleological principle within living beings that leads their development towards a specific end. Uexküll argued, on the basis of research involving ticks, sea urchins, amoeba, and jellyfish, that animals perceive and react only to species-specific sensory stimuli in their environments, registering the features of their environment that are significant to them, given their sensory organs and physical constitution. Only certain things are stimuli for animals, and has to do with their own constitution. Heidegger draws on this research to illustrate his thesis that animals are captivated, that's the word that he uses, the nomen, by their environment, grasping elements around them exclusively in terms of their biological impulses, their instincts, and drives. For instance, he refers to species of insects where the female eats the male after mating, after mating would be counterproductive for evolutionary purposes. And he takes this to mean that the one animal is never there for the other simply as a living creature, but is only there for either a sexual partner or as prey. The insect does not relate to the other as what it is. The drivenness that makes it a species of living being, rather than an inanimate thing, at the same time confines it within the ring of its self-absorbed instinctual capacities, and their reach determines its encounter with what surrounds it. Okay, setting aside the questionability, to say the least, of drawing conclusions about, quote, animals in general, from, quote, insects in particular, he actually does that, doesn't stop to think, hey, wait a minute. Putting that aside, the intent of these descriptions is to lay the basis for a contrast with human capacities, most fundamentally the human ability to allow entities to manifest themselves as beings. The contrast carries epistemological as well as ethical implications. So in Heidegger's analysis, the capacity for language, for naming something as something, rests in this freedom from instinctual immersion through which, he thinks, things become perceptible to us rather than merely acting upon us as stimuli in the way that they do for animals. This manifestness of entities is a condition for the possibility of both scientific investigation and the manipulation of tools within everyday practical being in the world that Heidegger had described in Being in Time. But commenting on that description of tool use in Being in Time, he writes in Fundamental Questions of Metaphysics, it never occurred to me, however, to try and claim or prove with this interpretation that the essence of man consists in the fact that he knows how to handle knives and forks or use the tram. That really wasn't the point, and it's a point that a lot of scholars seem to have missed. It consists rather in the fact that human comportment is always distinct from animal behavior. On this analysis, the way I am when sunk in daily preoccupations is still different from the animal's absorption in itself, because I am not bound by instinctive needs and do not encounter what is around me as stimuli. I have a relation to my own being and that of others, such that I can restrain myself and pay regard to them. I can also refuse and let myself be driven, but this is a perversion for which I am inescapably responsible, in a way that no animal is. Thus, man can sink lower than any animal, Heidegger writes, and no animal can become depraved in the same way as man. A number of commentators, including Derrida, have rightly complained that Heidegger ignores the vast differences between animal species, as well as drawing an unsustainably sharp line between their capacities and ours. It should be underlined that this too common gesture has been employed to reduce animals to the status of tools, and Kant is a prime example of that. That said, it does not actually follow from Heidegger's account that animals are rightly seen as ready to hand. The liberating solicitude that constitutes authentic being with and being in time would not be appropriate in relation to them, supposing Heidegger were right about the driven nature of all animals, since it involves a recognition of freedom. It's respect for the other's freedom. And that is for the freedom of a being that has a relationship to itself and can choose to be in one way or another. In addition, Heidegger's setting aside their relations of affection and care for their young that animals also display. Sort of drawing generalizations, but all animals from insects. In favor of a picture of them as motivated entirely by self-preserving drives, I mean, it's unwarranted for sure, and it reduces space for fellowship and respect. However, the human capacity to see entities as entities also allows us to go along with animals so as to understand them as living beings. We can, in a way, see how things stand for the dog, the lizard, even the bee, which they cannot do, Heidegger thinks, in relation to us. That makes it possible, in principle, for other living beings to be disclosed to us as other than raw material for products that serve our own needs, even if Heidegger does not develop that possibility, at least at this stage of his thought. Thank you.
Yeah, so we have a good amount of food for thought, so I'm sure there must be
A lot. Sorry, that was a bit dense.
Just, ma'am, thank you, ma'am, for a very nice presentation. When Heidegger makes a shift from being and time towards on time and being, what kind of change you find in his approach towards the other? One thing. Second is that you were saying that Heidegger is denying fact value dichotomy. So could you elaborate it a little more? Because it is not psychological even, but kind of like when he's denying fact value dichotomy, Heidegger is denying, you said, then please elaborate it a little more.
Sorry, the second question is denying
The fact value dichotomy.
distinction.
Oh, the fact value distinction.
Yeah, then what kind of that within this denial of dichotomy? Because many aspects are there, elaborated a little more. So first is that, no, that when he's changing his position, that what perspective is changed in the view towards the other.
Yeah, that's a very large question actually. I mean, timing being is a very late essay, so I wouldn't necessarily comment on that precise essay, but there's a number of changes that Heidegger undergoes from the earlier to the later works. One thing is that he becomes very aware of historicality. Right? So that was there in Being in Time, but it becomes sort of clearer and clearer to him, and it challenges the whole project of phenomenology. Right? I mean, if we're historically through culturally rooted, our concepts are so as well, then a pure phenomenology becomes, phenomenology still had universalist ambitions, right? So that becomes impossible. And so he turns to more historical reflections. There's a lot of commentaries on other authors, and he looks, instead of analyzing, Dasein in general through the things that it makes, he analyzes humanity at the present moment, in the modern age, the technological age, in terms of the specific kinds of things that we are making. Right? So it's a turn to a more to social critique, okay? And to a critique of the present moment. Okay. As for the relation to the other, the switch is reflected well in this change from the term Entschlossenheit, resoluteness, to Gelassenheit, which is serenity, composure, which you still find in the later works. There's a continuity in that. There was in Being in Time this obligation, it is presented in a critical spirit to let the entity that you are addressing show itself as it is in itself, right? That applies to things, right? And it applies to persons as well. And in the later works, that strand still remains, the kind of letting go of the will, right? Vilasana is about letting go too, allowing the other to speak. And the cross-cultural interactions are geared towards that. The text on the way to language, which is a dialogue with the Japanese interlocutor. Now, it's a dialogue that is supposed to represent what Heidegger thinks is the appropriate way of having a dialogue with the cultural other, the actual other set that the dialogue didn't perceive of. So yeah, okay. Second question of the fact-value distinction, I think it goes back to a sort of Aristotelian point, right? I mean, the fact-value distinction is a modern distinction. Aristotle doesn't use it, he speaks of the good. Right? And there's for Heidegger, yeah, you recognize what an entity is, and it just follows from that there is an appropriate way of being towards it. And so, how, in that case, within that sort of analysis, you don't really have a distinction between fact and value. Right? It's not that you could recognize the facts without there being any normative implications.
I have two questions. When you distinguish between strong animal and man, right? That's world poor. Sorry, world less.
Heidegger's.
Yeah, sorry. Heidegger's distinction. World less and world poor and world from.
Yeah.
And he says anthropocentric. Right? This character is anthropocentric.
It is. You can criticize that, sure.
But given these three possibilities, wouldn't you think that perhaps to make even animal as like characterize its essence as world from will be anthropocentric, given that we ourselves are anthropocentric, world from.
Yeah, you would. I mean, I'm not saying that you should describe animals as the same as us, right? But closer attention to how they actually are would have, I think, challenged the description he comes up with, that they are purely driven by self-serving instincts. It's not that simple, right? The example of the insect that for whom the other is first a mate and then food. For certain species of insects, but mammals don't behave that way. They care for their young. There are animals that also mate for life. They feel affection. They feel loyalty. Heidegger mentions a dog a couple of times, but he doesn't pay much attention. So that's what I mean. He draws this really, really sharp line, and of course it's an ethically problematic line, because it has been used to, it follows Kant in this, and it's been used to say we don't have any moral obligations towards animals. And also draws this line, right, where, certain classes of human beings are also always in danger of slipping below the line. And they are compared with animals. God help you if you're in that class where you are, where it's decided that you're a race or whatever because of your disabilities, that you are like animals, because what it means is that you have no moral standing whatsoever.
Second question. For a reference, like let's say take Plato's tripartite division, reason, spirit, and appetite. And if the abyss between man and animality, right? If you consider a human being, like the animality aspect of human being can be, now let's say it's the appetite, and as a man, the reason, and even being man himself, don't we see at this separation between this reason and appetite? There is no sort of.
For Heidegger, no. That is something that differentiates him from Kant. No, he does not divide our nature into an appetitive faculty and a rational faculty. It is rather that this sort of reflectivity we have, this standing back, this distance, it changes everything. So that we eat in a different way. I mean, for Heidegger, the animal feeds and we eat. Our relation to everything is different. So yeah, that's something that distinguishes him from some traditional authors, including Kant. We are never animals for Heidegger. We can be much worse. It's not necessarily a plus, right? But we are never just animals.
I guess I just am interested in the central point that the abyss between humans and animals in Heidegger is not necessitated or does not necessitate that there is no care towards among humans.
I'm saying it doesn't follow.
It doesn't follow,
Doesn't-
right? Would you think that care follows or there's room for care? And if there is, what's the basis?
Well, so I'm drawing some implications from this notion that the character of an entity already tells you what is an appropriate relation to it, right? So from this account, it does follow that respect for persons is not the appropriate relation to animals, and you're not obligated to respect freedom, because when Heidegger's in us, they don't have any. We could also say that some animals do, and I think it's true, some animals do. But if they are still driven, if they are still sentient, right, if they are still capable of suffering, I don't see why it wouldn't follow that we have some direct duties to them as a result of recognizing that. Heidegger doesn't work that out. I'm just saying
That we could.
yeah, we could, and animals are not tools in his analysis. He doesn't analyze them that way.
We're not ready to have.
They're not ready to have.
My question is about the idea of world. You say human being is world forming, animals are world work, objects are world less. Okay? So what's the criterion for this division? Whether is it because human being exists in a meaningful way, it's like a meaningful relation? If so, then what happens in the case of severe anxiety and depression? So in contemporary philosophical psychopathology, they say in severe case of depression, the body almost becomes matter, so-called corporealization of the body, so identified with the matter. So in that case, we find a complete breakdown of the meaning mechanism. So you don't find anything meaningful. The world is entirely, it doesn't work. So that's a kind of breakdown in the meaning making process. So in that sense, can we say a person in severe anxiety and depression is worldless, world poor?
I don't think we can, no, because that's a person for whom the world has slipped into insignificance in a way that it only can for a human being. Right? I mean, when Heidegger describes a moment of anxiety, he does describe a complete dissolution of the meaningfulness of the world. Right? It's kind of the everyday preoccupations. You're busy doing things, accumulating stuff, your practical concerns, and then you have this, and it's especially in the face of death, right? You have this moment of angst where it all slips away, right? And there you are before your own naked being world possess, right? So that is something that for Heidegger only an entity with our kind of structure could undergo. He may be wrong about that, right? But having an existential crisis, I think having a prolonged kind of crisis of the sort one might have in a depression, it's still going to be specifically human for Heidegger. The world becoming meaningless is still having a world.
Let me just try to understand one point. Though Heidegger may not be directly dealing with the ethical, but somehow it is implicit, I can understand what you are presenting. But I want to problematize this with two possibilities of recognizing the other. And then I want to ask you that are they of the same kind? And this is keeping in mind Levinas in mind. One is that the Daseins' own existence begins with the recognition of the other Daseins. That in the sense that my being makes meaningful only when I recognize the fullness of the other. So you bring in ethical on this, that the equal beings, autonomous. This is one. The other is that my recognition of the other is by the circumstances. As you said in the later, he was more into towards the witness of unfolding of the historical events that comes in. Not necessarily I recognize the other as equally autonomous, but the forces of the historicity compels me to recognize. Am I making sense? These two are, would you put them as two same ground to talk about ethics?
I think, what I tried to show is that liberating solicitude is a recognition of the other, right, as another like myself. And it's a kind of Kantian recognition. In the later works, I think there is less. Look, there isn't that much focus in being in time either on liberating solicitude, right? Like you could have developed that a lot more. I've mentioned it; it's there, but it's in a few pages of being in time. It's not central. So it certainly could be criticized for that. And in his later works, he's much more concerned with sort of the condition of homelessness and abandonment that he thinks we are in. So focusing on problems of technology, environmental concerns, those kinds of issues. What he calls technicity, which he thinks dominates in the modern age, that's a frame that Foucault takes and applies to the social management of human beings in this age. But Heidegger doesn't really do that, right? It's just implicit. So it's not. I mean, I think the ethical component is there, but the face-to-face recognition of the other.
Maybe you can come closer. You can come closer with her.
Yeah, I mean that is not pronounced in Heidegger's thought for
Yeah.
sure. And he's also, frankly, not very self-aware, not very self-reflective. That said, I mean, I have a lot of problems with Levinas as well. Right? I mean, for all that, his racism, sexism, his weaseliness when it came to the issue of Palestinians. I don't see Levinas as a great resource for ethics either, to be blunt.
So, when we're talking about the authentic way of being, and we're connecting that with being responsible, and you were also at the same time talking about resoluteness. So, are these two notions connected, or in what aspect are you exploring being responsible? What is responsibility?
Authenticity is on Heidegger's account an acceptance of responsibility. respect, just simply being responsible.
Yeah, so does that mean does that contain the relationality aspect also? Because later you said that it's about self-assertion and responsiveness. So
Yeah.
responsiveness is towards someone, it's also towards yourself, but it's also towards the other.
Yeah, I think it describes it a lot as it's a responsiveness to what it is that the situation requires of me, right? And there isn't an account of responsiveness to the other, but there is that bit about Dasein as a soul authentic for the sake of which, right? I do think it sort of follows from Heidegger's account that you treat others. Authenticity means also being in the truth, and that means holding yourself to the truth. And the truth about other instances of Dasein, let's say, necessitates a certain way of being towards them, which is liberating solicitude. So to fail doing that is to be responsible and not hold yourself to a truth that conscience should reveal to you. I think that's what there is in Heidegger's account. But there isn't a lot of focus on interpersonal relations. Yeah. I wasn't necessarily defending Heideggerian ethics, but I want to say that it's there, right? He's often contrasted with Kant, and I tend to think, no, actually the flaws in Heidegger are more like the same flaws that you find in Kant. And he does talk about respect for the other. He does not talk about empathy or compassion, but neither does Kant.
I'll ask a question. So you mentioned how much Heidegger, one example you give is how animals feed and we eat.
That's what Heidegger says.
Yeah. And but once it is said in that way, then it becomes important to ask as to we in humans also in certain circumstances feed in the sense that the spatial attribute of being human or having the as you said existential crisis and sort of say to considering humans as exceptionally rational beings that somehow are separate from animals. So I mean I will bring the question up into the question is that once you say that animals feed and we think of circumstances or that the humans eating can be attributed to be as unreflective or as lack of the, let's say, the phenomenological content, then it would it be, can we say that some of the eating among the humans is also feeding? And once we bring that, then there are further questions that follow from there.
I think for Heidegger, the point would be, so we have this sort of distance, right? This capacity for self-restraint. It is for Kant what gives us word dignity. If we ask, do human beings also sometimes feed? Well, I think the answer here would be they do. And it involves a certain loss of humanity. And we experience it as that, right? And we describe it in that way. If, for instance, they've been starved and they're given food and they feed like animals, we may feel sorrow, this loss of human dignity. If they have plenty of food and yet they need, right? We describe them as like pigs, right? That sort of insult of being a pig is not something you could ever deliver to a pig, right? Because that's natural for it. So I think that's the point. That's what we follow. So we're never like animals. there's always that kind of difference.
But I think admitting that kind of ethical consequences into thinking that we do have ethical concerns for people who are thieving, and we cannot see that as ethically indifferent kind of an activity that we don't want to look at. Whereas when we talk of legal ethics, we don't tend to give the same kind of importance. As to once you admit to thieving, let's say in humans and in animals, given the case that most of the time humans are eating, once you conceive a position like that, then that follows there are ethical concerns that often are along with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the complaints about the hard line that Heidegger draws between animals and humans, coming from the perspective of animal ethics, is that it leads to this disregard of animals, right? But, I mean, I think Heidegger's wrong about that strong line. It's much more complicated than that, I think. But on the other hand, I do also think in general, and this is not just about Heidegger, that believing that animals are very different from us, even radically different from us, it doesn't follow from that they would have no ethical status. I mean, so what? But I also, I don't agree with this Kantian ethics. I mean, I also want to say, but because it's very problematic when you turn that into disability, right? You look at the way racialized people have been dumped into the animal category. But, I fundamentally reject the Kantian idea that it is this capacity for self-mastery that gives an entity moral status. Right? The consequence of it that we have to respect the freedom of the other and not be paternalistic. Okay, I can understand that only applies to a being that has that kind of freedom. But I don't see why having that kind of freedom is the only thing that gives an entity moral status. Whereas for Kant it is. And I think you see that in Being and Time too. It's very Kantian in that way.
Question, because you say that there is not much discussion between Heidegger and Kant, but if Heidegger is saying that there is no fact value distinction, then there is no question of whether animals should be brought under the ethical domain or not. They should be by default brought under the ethical domain. There is no fact value distinction.
Yeah, I mean, he's not like Kant in a different way, but in his analysis of person, what is great about Kant is that Kant does not work out the subjectivity of the subject, and that's what Heidegger is filling in Being and Time. Right? That he says Kant does not analyze the character of the I, and he means that practical I that is engaged in action. That's what Heidegger provides in Being and Time. And there are other ways in which he does differ from Kant. Within Heidegger's own framework, you wouldn't really talk about moral status. But that's kind of what I was saying at the end, that you would need to, even if he were right about animals only being driven, right, in the way that he says, we would need to reflect upon, well, what is the appropriate form of comportment towards an entity that is like that? Right? There would still be a fitting way of relating to it. Now, in his later thought, it becomes more kind of environmental, right? It becomes about the way things fit together, right? He still doesn't talk about what precisely is due to animals, or what exactly is appropriate for individuals. I don't think that was really on the radar screen, but I'm trying to draw some stuff. I'm trying to draw implications that he doesn't also draw.
More questions? Can I have one last question? She will have to go.
So you never accepted.
No, you go.
So has
Let's go.
My question is regarding the definition of authenticity itself. You mentioned it's something that comes from the Dasein, but also goes beyond it. So,
The definition of what?
the authenticity, authenticity itself. So, with that, so that implies that there's some sort of passivity in terms of Dasein itself, but it is just partially accepting something when it says it goes beyond. So, with this point, I want to ask if it's more of a dialectical relation between the other and the Dasein, or the Dasein and the Dasein, or is it more of a practical exploration in terms of setting limits to which the Dasein can include on itself?
Yeah, I mean that bit about from me and beyond me is what how Heidegger describes the call of conscience, actually. Right? But he's not. It's not. But ultimately, he says conscience is not something foreign. It is just the call itself. It seems foreign to everyday Dasein, which is immersed in its concerns, right? So it's that structure of the self where you can, command and also obey yourself. Right? So the conscience, called conscience, it is me, but yet it is something that I can follow or refuse. So, yeah, Nietzsche talks about that too, right? That obeying.
So where does this exact element of the self going beyond appear in this case?
The self going beyond.
Yes, also authenticity.
Yeah.
You mentioned the definition that it also goes beyond the self. It is from me, but also beyond me.
That's
That's
about the call of conscience.
conscience.
Yeah, it comes from me and beyond, from beyond. And then, what he says about the other, I mean, it's what I've said about liberating solicitude, but there's also before that, others are everywhere in the texture of the world. Everything refers to others. We do things jointly. A tool, of course, refers to those who made it, those who use it, etc. So we become aware of others in that way. In the first instance, for the most part. It's a phenomenological account that starts with how we are in the first instance, for the most part, as adults. It's not an account of human development. You might want to say, well, no, this is how we first become aware of the other, right? The baby first becomes aware of the face of the person, the mother, so the father who hopefully loves another, right? So that's missing in it. That's true for Kant too, right? These guys, yeah, I don't know, they don't really think about stuff like that, right? Be raised, yeah. Mothers. Heidegger's part of his mother does actually write a book about that at times, but that stuff doesn't figure in their phenomenological accounts. And it's the same for Kant. So whom I'm also not a big fan. It's hard at this point to say of whom am I a big fan. Yeah. I mean, within like German philosophy, right? Yeah.
So
There's a racism and there's a sexism, and there's just so much missing.
So, if you're sort of still good to speak a little bit, one last question. I was wondering, since Heidegger seems to have take on Aristotle, probably you would have sort of known about weakness of the will, appreciation of if I remember it correctly. So, how do we sort of take that into account? Say, for example, if animal might save my life, actually, sort of, it did occur to me. So, I know how animals kind of do and sort of react in certain situations. But when it's the other way around, which actually again something new that could have happened, I would reflect a lot whether I would, do that same for the animal. So and this is probably one big difference between an animal and sort of design in the human sense that and is it something always to be sort of appreciated. Does Heidegger have a take on that? Because I might, I may feel at times, I may be able to differentiate, which makes me human. But then that could precisely be the cause of my failing to act ethically at times. Whereas an animal wouldn't fail.
Um, yeah, it could be if it's something that conscience calls upon you to do. Go for Heidegger. That's the lack, right? Later on, you're going to feel yourself to have been responsible for a not being, NOT, right? The animal that you should have saved, but you have misgivings and you're worried about whatever. If we get away from Heidegger and just think generally, I don't want to say stuff about animals as such. I'd rather not, because I think that's a huge variety, right? So what species are we talking about? So I usually avoid that kind of talk. I just assume that in Heidegger, just talking about his conception of the animal, and it's a very influential conception of the animal, right? Like this gesture of defining ourselves in contrast with animality is you find it throughout certainly Western philosophy.
Just to follow, I mean, also say, for example, there may be some kind of sort of people, say, for example, and I'm telling you from my actual conversation with somebody, I was walking a dog in snow, and some of the people around the village told me that it's not a good idea, dog may be attacked, and then you'll have to intervene. And they were very sure about this. They had no sort of kind of dilemma about this, that if it were me to be with them, they would just intervene. It was just that, I kept thinking about this, whether I would. So if, ethically speaking, these people I was having this conversation with, I mean, till today I feel they were more ethical than I was. So design, sort of being so sure about something, it seems intuitively is more ethical.
Well, again, parallel with Kant, that's problematic, right? And Kant gets criticized for this quite a bit. But for Kant, the ethical consists in following duty over desire, right? And it seems to follow that somebody who hesitates to do something that's the right thing is more virtuous, as it were, than somebody who just does it because it's their nature and inclination. Right? And that does not sound right. That does not sound right.
Not for Heidegger.
Well, for Heidegger, though, it's still, it is that capacity for distance, and your willingness to hold yourself to the call of conscience, right? It's that act of decision. It's not your ingrained compassionate character, for instance, right? For these guys. So yeah. So I think about Kant saying that there's no merit in if a generous person simply spreads his wealth around, for instance. But because Kant assumes that he's doing it for the pleasure that he gets out of giving to others. And that's just such an impoverished analysis. I mean, wait a minute, you get pleasure out of helping others because you want to help others. You're not doing it for the pleasure, right? But yeah, that's. I think this is also based on it's about decision, right? Like we can't.
In the case of Kant, I think it's not so much of the pleasure. I think he thinks that inclination is undependent. So today, if you are in a good mind, and you feel inclined to help the other guy, but then tomorrow you may not be so inclined. So you cannot trust goodness to something so changeable as that.
That's what he says, but it shouldn't follow from that an act of generosity that comes from the sentiment of wanting to be generous doesn't have any merit. And Kant doesn't seem to pay attention to, there are other ethical philosophies, like I think of Confucian ethics, where it's all about cultivating sentiments. And this is not true, the sentiments are just there or not there, you can cultivate them.
I think in his case, he means to say that when you act out of just the respect for the moral law, then you have that action has distinctively moral merit. The other case may have any other kind of merit, the generosity,
not moral.
but not distinctively moral.
That's right.
I think it's about purity of moral motivation.
And it's-
Obviously, I mean, we can't see that. No, I was just wondering about Ajay's example of the dog, and I was just thinking whether, whether Kant or Heidegger would even acknowledge any distinctively moral merit in, Ajay intervening between the dog and other dogs who attack him.
Yeah, Beer was like.
No, I'm just wondering whether they would even acknowledge that there is distinctively moral merit in such an intervention. Because do we have an imperfect duty of obligation
Well,
or a perfect
yeah.
duty of obligation?
For Kant,
Since he's asking from a Heideggerian perspective.
well, for Kant, it's an indirect duty to animals. It's just because if we're cruel to animals, we'll be cruel to humans, and that doesn't seem right. For Heidegger, as I said, I mean, you have to work out the implications because he doesn't directly talk about it. Right? So he draws this gulf between humans and animals. As if we wanted to say it doesn't follow from that animals, that there wouldn't be, it doesn't follow from that animals are tools. Let's just put it that way. There would still be an appropriate mode of comportment towards animals, towards creatures of that kind. We have to think about what that is. I would think that a duty of compassion here shouldn't follow.
I think Bruno Latour has developed this thing from Martin Heidegger, and he has elaborated this in his actor network theory, ATN, that everything in the space environment is agent, moral agent, shaping the consciousness, shaping this everything. So Bruno Latour is developing this and trying to give moral agency to the environment also.
That's quite far from Heidegger, though.
Yeah.
I mean, the later Heidegger, yes, the way things fit together within the environment becomes important. But if you're reading agency to things within the environment, that's not where he goes. Yeah. But that's an interesting idea.
So I think we shouldn't use endlessly, but it has been a very very interesting learning session. I'm sure all of us can do that, and I can't thank you enough for accepting our invitation to come here also and the visitors for yet again. And as usual, we look forward to your next visit. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
How long you are staying?
Can stay for another week, then we're back to Goa. We spent the winters.
Okay. Do you have any relations in Punjab?
Not very many, but they're all moved to Delhi.